No one in the crowd even looked at her twice. The little girl with a sack over her head, too broken, too forgotten. But when the cowboy lifted that sack, what he saw didn't just steal his breath, it broke his heart wide open. The sun beat down mercilessly on the small, dusty town, turning the air thick with heat and grit. In the center of the square, a rough wooden platform had been set up, its planks creaking under the weight of nervous footsteps and the jeering crowd that had gathered. It wasn't cattle or horses being sold that day. It was something far darker. A small figure, wrapped in rags and with a burlap sack tied overhead, was pushed forward by a grizzled auctioneer. His voice rang out, sharp and eager, as if he were calling out the weight of a steer instead of a child's worth. The townsfolk shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Some turned away, unwilling to look too closely at the shame of it all. Others stayed, eyes glinting with curiosity, waiting to see if anyone would dare place a bid on a child who had already been branded as unwanted. The girl's thin shoulders trembled beneath the sack, her small hands clutching the hem of her worn dress as if it were the only thing she had left to hold. She made no sound, not even a whimper, as the auctioneer barked, "Who'll start the bidding?" From the edge of the crowd, a tall cowboy leaned against a weathered post, hat pulled low over his brow. Ethan Cole had come to town for supplies. Not for this. His broad frame and sun-scorched skin marked him as a man of the land, one who spent more time among cattle and dust than among men. Yet as his steel-gray eyes fell on the trembling figure on the stage, something in his chest tightened. He knew what it was to feel like you didn't belong. He knew what it was to be left behind. The auctioneer's voice grew sharper, tinged with desperation. No one? Not a single coin? She'll work for her keep. Strong enough for chores. Who's willing to take her in? A few men chuckled cruelly, muttering about how even a sack over her head couldn't hide what she must be. Damaged goods. One spat on the dirt. The girl flinched, shrinking further into herself, though she still didn't cry. It was as if tears had long ago been beaten out of her. Ethan shifted his weight, his jaw tightening. He told himself it wasn't his concern. He had a ranch to run, fences to mend, cattle to move. What business did he have taking on a broken child? Yet when the girl turned her head ever so slightly, the sack brushing against her cheek, Ethan saw the outline of her small face, the curve of her chin, the fragile angle of her jaw, and something inside him cracked. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. He had once been that small, unseen, unwanted. The bidding stalled. The crowd began to murmur, restless and mocking. "Ain't nobody want her," a woman whispered harshly. "Best send her back where she came from." The auctioneer looked ready to cut his losses, already motioning to drag the girl off the stage. Her knees buckled as if she expected it, as if she had been thrown away before and knew the routine. Ethan's voice cut through the air, low but steady. "I'll take her." The crowd fell silent, surprised. Heads turned toward him, suspicion and curiosity mingling in their eyes. The auctioneer blinked, then quickly regained his smirk. "Well now, looks like we got ourselves a buyer. 1 coin, 2? Do I hear more?" But no one else spoke. No one else cared enough to raise a hand. Ethan stepped forward, pulling a few crumpled bills from his pocket. He laid them down without ceremony, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. The auctioneer snatched them up, eager to be rid of the girl. "Sold," he barked, slapping his hand against the podium. The small figure swayed on her feet, as if unsure what this new fate meant. Ethan climbed the steps to the stage, his boots heavy against the wood. He paused before her, towering but calm. Slowly, gently, he reached for the burlap sack tied around her neck. The knot came loose beneath his calloused fingers, and with one careful pull, the sack fell away. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ethan looked down, and for the first time, he saw her face. It wasn't just the bruises, faint but telling, or the dirt smeared across her delicate features. It was the eyes, wide, hollow, and filled with a pain far too old for such a young child. They pierced through him, cutting deeper than any blade could. Ethan had thought himself hardened, scarred by life and loss. But in that moment, staring into her shattered gaze, his heart broke wide open. He knew, without a doubt, that he hadn't simply bought a child at an auction. He had just taken responsibility for a soul that had been abandoned by the world. And no matter the cost, he wasn't going to let her be unwanted again. The coarse fabric slipped from her head, falling to the wooden floor with a soft thud that echoed far louder than it should have. For the first time, the crowd saw the face that had been hidden away. The girl's hair, tangled and matted, framed a face far too thin for her age. Her skin was pale beneath layers of dirt, though faint bruises lingered on her cheekbones and jawline. Silent march of a life no child should have known. She blinked rapidly against the harsh sunlight, her eyes squinting as though even light itself was something foreign and cruel. The silence that followed was suffocating. It stretched across the dusty auction yard, broken only by the restless shifting of boots and the dry creak of leather saddles. Then came the whispers. A woman gasped softly and covered her mouth. A man snorted in disgust, muttering that she looked half-starved, good for nothing. Another laughed, a cruel, sharp sound that stung the air. That's what was under the sack? Lord have mercy, no wonder no one wanted her. The words hung heavy, yet the girl didn't flinch at them. Her gaze remained lowered, her small hands twisted tightly together, as though she had long since grown used to being ridiculed. But Ethan Cole wasn't laughing. Standing only a step away, he looked at her with steady, unyielding eyes. Beneath the dirt, beneath the bruises, he saw something the others couldn't or refused to. There was fragility, yes, and pain so raw it scraped against the soul. Yet there was also a quiet resilience in the way she held herself, refusing to cry, refusing to beg. It was a strength born from surviving, and it shook Ethan in a way he hadn't expected. The auctioneer cleared his throat, trying to smooth over the unease. Well, there you have it, folks. The girl sold. Nothing more to see here. He made a half-hearted wave of his hand, as though dismissing her existence altogether. The crowd began to thin, some shaking their heads, others smirking as though they'd just witnessed a show. A few lingered, staring at Ethan with thinly veiled curiosity. Why had he taken her? What use could a hardened cowboy have for a half-broken child? The girl dared to lift her eyes for the first time, and in that fleeting glance, Ethan's chest tightened. Her eyes were large, startlingly so, but hollowed by fear and exhaustion. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, endured too much, and expected nothing but more pain to come. He had known fear in his life, had lost people he'd loved, had walked through grief so heavy it nearly buried him. But this kind of terror in a child's eyes was something else entirely. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Ethan slowly crouched down, lowering himself to her level. The brim of his hat shaded his expression, but his voice was low and even, meant only for her. "You're safe now," he said. Simple words, but they carried a weight, a promise that even he hadn't realized he was ready to make. The girl blinked, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the strength. Behind them, another snicker rose from the thinning crowd. "Safe?" a man scoffed. "Boy, she'll be nothing but trouble. Best thing you could do is send her back." Ethan didn't turn to answer. He didn't need to. His silence, his steady posture in front of the girl, was louder than any retort could be. The girl's gaze dropped again, her shoulders curling inward, as if bracing for the disappointment she always expected. But Ethan reached out, not to touch her, not yet, only to set the fallen sack far away on the platform, making sure she saw it. It was a small act, but a deliberate one. That sack wasn't going back over her head. Not ever again. The last of the crowd dispersed, their voices fading into the hum of town life. Only dust and the memory of their laughter lingered in the air. Ethan finally stood, offering his hand down to her. He didn't force her. He didn't rush her. His hand simply waited, steady and patient. For a long, tense heartbeat, the girl stared at it. Her fingers twitched, hesitant, frightened of what taking that hand might mean. And then, with the smallest movement, she placed her tiny, trembling hand into his. Ethan's jaw tightened as he closed his hand around hers, gentle but firm, as if he were anchoring her to something she had never known before, stability, protection, the faintest shadow of belonging. In that moment, he made the promise he hadn't dared speak aloud. Whatever her past had been, it ended here. She would not be unwanted again. Not while he still had breath in his body. The town faded behind them with each slow step of the horse, its noise and cruelty shrinking into the distance until only dust and silence remained. Ethan rode steady, his broad frame upright in the saddle, the little girl perched carefully in front of him. She was rigid, stiff as a board, as though his touch might burn or his arms might turn cruel at any second. Her small fist clutched the hem of her worn dress instead of holding on to the reins or to him. She didn't trust his steadiness. Not yet. Her silence weighed heavier than any words could. Not once since leaving the auction yard had she spoken. Not a question, not a whisper. She kept her face turned away, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if determined not to meet his gaze. Ethan didn't press her. He knew that kind of silence. It wasn't empty, it was full. Full of fears too deep to name. Full of memories too painful to let loose. He remembered his own silence years ago, when the world had taken from him and left him hollow. The road stretched ahead, winding through barren land that had seen better days. The prairie grass was dry and brittle under the summer sun, rattling faintly when the wind stirred it. The sky above was wide and endless, blue and merciless, with not a cloud in sight. To most men, the land seemed unforgiving. Too empty, too broken to nurture anything. To Ethan, it was a mirror, a land scarred, yet still standing, just like him. And now, just like the girl who rode with him. At one point, the horse stumbled slightly on the rocky trail, and Ethan instinctively tightened his arm around her tiny frame. She flinched at the contact, her shoulders snapping tight as though expecting pain to follow. Ethan froze, keeping his arm gentle and loose, his voice low and even. "Easy now," he murmured, not just to the horse but to her as well. "You're all right. Nobody's going to hurt you." His words were simple, but they hung in the air like a fragile thread, waiting to be trusted. She didn't answer. She didn't even glance at him, but he felt the smallest shift, her body no longer leaning away quite so hard, no longer braced for the blow that never came. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something, a crack in the wall she had built around herself. Ethan knew better than to push through it. A man didn't tear down walls like that. He waited patiently until they opened from the inside. The land began to change as they rode farther west. The barren trail opened into stretches of quiet hills and scattered fences, most broken and weathered with age. A windmill creaked in the distance, its blades turning slow and tired, groaning like an old soul. Beyond it lay the faint outline of Ethan's ranch. Modest, nothing grand, just a house of worn wood, and a barn that leaned slightly under years of storms. It wasn't much, but it was his. And now, somehow, it would be hers too. The girl's eyes flickered toward the ranch, cautious and uncertain. Ethan caught the look, but he didn't speak. He could only imagine what it must look like to her. Another place where she might be put to work, another roof under which fear might follow her. He hated the thought, hated that she had no reason yet to believe this ride would be different from all the others in her past. So he tried again, softer this time, almost like speaking to a skittish foal. "That's home up ahead," he said, his tone patient. "Not just mine. Yours too, if you'll have it." He didn't expect an answer, but the words were important. They needed to be said, if only to plant the seed. She shifted slightly, not in agreement, not even in comfort, but in thought. It was the first sign she'd heard him at all. Her silence wasn't the silence of dismissal anymore. It was the silence of a child weighing words, testing them, wondering if they could be true. The sun had dipped lower by the time they reached the gate. The wooden post creaked under his hand as he pushed it open, guiding the horse into the yard. The land stretched wide around them, empty in some places, rough in others, but there was a strange peace in it too. It wasn't perfect, not even close, but it was steady, a place where broken things could rest and maybe, just maybe, mend. Ethan dismounted first, his boots crunching against the dry earth. He turned and offered his hand up to the girl. She hesitated, her eyes darting from his calloused palm to the ground below. For a moment, she looked as though she might refuse. Then, slowly, she placed her small hand into his, just as she had at the auction. He lifted her down gently, careful not to startle her. The girl stood in the yard, staring at the house with its peeling paint and the barn that leaned tiredly to one side. To anyone else, it was nothing remarkable. To Ethan, it was a place of second chances. He hoped, he hoped that someday she would see it that way too. And as a quiet evening wind brushed over them, carrying the faint scent of earth and hay, Ethan made a silent vow. They were both broken, both carrying shadows too heavy for words. But maybe here, on this quiet, barren land, they could begin to piece themselves back together. The ranch house was quiet when they stepped inside, its wooden floorboards creaking faintly under the weight of their boots. Dust drifted in the golden shafts of evening light, but the air carried a warmth that the auction yard never could. Ethan led the little girl down the narrow hallway, his step steady, hers hesitant, until they stopped at a small wooden door. He pushed it open gently, revealing a room he had readied earlier in the day. It wasn't grand, just a modest square with a wooden bed tucked against the wall, a fresh quilt folded neatly at its end, and a little table with a glass of water resting on top. But what made the space different were the details. A soft blanket that smelled faintly of lavender, a worn but carefully polished rocking chair in the corner, and on the shelf by the window, a few small toys carved from wood, horses, a rabbit, and even a clumsy little doll with yarn for hair. Ethan had made some of them years ago, in the long winters when silence had been his only companion. Others he had picked up here and there, never sure why he kept them, until now. The girl froze in the doorway, her wide eyes scanning every corner as though this were some kind of trick. She had expected a barn floor or a pile of straw, or maybe a dark corner where no one would notice her. Not this, not a bed of her own, clean and waiting as though she mattered. Her gaze lingered on the blanket, then on the toys. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she stepped inside, her small feet making no sound. She reached out with trembling fingers, brushing the edge of the quilt as though she feared it would vanish the moment she touched it. Then her hand moved toward the wooden horse on the shelf. She held it carefully, cradling it in her palms as though it were something precious, something she'd never had before. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, watching quietly. He didn't speak, didn't want to startle her out of the moment. He only let her explore, let her see that the space was hers alone. After a long silence, he finally said, "This is your room, nobody else's. You can rest here, safe. Ain't much, but it's yours." The girl's head jerked toward him, her expression unreadable. There was suspicion there, a hard edge to her eyes that no child should carry. She had been promised safety before, only to have it torn away. Ethan could see that. He didn't try to convince her further. Trust wasn't built with speeches. It was built with time. As the evening deepened into night, Ethan showed her the pitcher of water by the bed, the drawer with clean clothes he had found, and the quilt tucked around the mattress. Each detail was small, but together they whispered something she had never known. Care. When he stepped back to leave her alone, she clutched the wooden horse tight against her chest. But the silence of the night was not the same for her as it was for him. Where Ethan found peace in the quiet, she found memories. The dark corner of a barn, the sound of harsh voices, the sting of hunger. Lie in the soft bed, she could not close her eyes. Every creak of the old house made her flinch. Every brush of the wind against the shutters felt like a threat. Hours passed, the moon climbing high, yet she remained awake, curled tight on the quilt, eyes wide. At last, she slipped from the bed, padding softly to the door. When she cracked it open, she found him. Ethan sat on the floor just outside her room, his back leaned against the wall, his hat tipped low over his brow. His long legs stretched out across the wooden floor, his rifle resting idly within reach. He wasn't asleep. He was keeping watch. For a long moment, the girl just stared at him, her small hand gripping the edge of the door. No words were spoken, but she understood. He had stayed. He wasn't guarding the house. He was guarding her. Something shifted inside her, something fragile and unfamiliar. Not trust, not yet, but the tiniest flicker of safety. Enough that, when she returned to the bed and clutched the wooden horse to her chest, her eyelids grew heavy. For the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to drift toward sleep. And outside her door, Ethan sat unmoving, the night stretching long and cold around him. He didn't care. He would stay as long as it took, 1 night or 100, until she believed the truth of what he silently promised. She would never be alone again. The morning sunlight crept across the wooden floorboards of the little room, painting golden lines over the quilt where the girl lay. She stirred awake, the wooden horse still clutched against her chest, her hair tangled, eyes red-rimmed from a restless night. For a moment, she almost forgot where she was. Then the scent of wood smoke and bread drifted in, and her eyes darted to the door. No harsh voices, no cold hands pulling her from bed, just silence, and the faint sound of someone moving in the kitchen. Her small fingers traced the stitches of the quilt, soft and unfamiliar under her touch. Memories clawed their way back in, uninvited. A damp cellar, a straw mat that smelled of rot, men laughing, saying no one wanted her anyway, while she pressed herself into a corner. A woman once shoved her outside into the cold with nothing but rags, muttering, "Better off gone." Words had stuck sharper than whips. She had been a burden, a mistake, an unwanted shadow. Even now, the voices lived inside her, louder than the calm of this quiet ranch. She sat up, pressing her knees to her chest. The scars weren't just on her skin, though those too existed, faint and pale, marks that no child should carry. The real scars were deeper, stitched into her very breathing. She had learned early that to speak was dangerous, to hope was foolish, and to trust was a kind of suicide. From the doorway, Ethan watched her quietly. He didn't intrude. He leaned against a frame with his arms folded, his weather-worn face unreadable, his hat tilted slightly back. When her wide eyes caught him, she flinched, expecting reprimand for lingering too long in bed. But the scolding never came. Instead, his voice was low, steady. "Morning." Just that. No demands. No orders. A greeting, plain and simple, as if she were someone worth greeting. She blinked at him, her lips parting as though she might answer, but no sound came. She only lowered her gaze back to her knees. He didn't push. He simply set a small cup on a little table by the window, a glass of milk warmed by the stove. The steam curled faintly in the cool morning air. Without another word, he left, his boots echoing down the hall. For a long while she stared at the glass, suspicion tightening her chest. In the past, food had been used as a weapon, withheld, rationed, sometimes laced with punishment. Hunger had taught her that nothing came without cost. And yet this milk sat quietly, untouched, waiting. Her hand trembled when she finally reached for it. She lifted it to her lips, tasting the warmth, expecting bitterness. Instead, it was plain, simple, safe. She drank in small, cautious sips until the glass was empty. Later, when Ethan returned check on her, the empty glass remained by the window. He noticed it but said nothing. He only tipped his hat slightly, his eyes softening with something unspoken. Through the day, the girl wandered the ranch house like a shadow, moving silently from room to room, never straying too far from the doorway of her own space. Outside, Ethan went about his chores, feeding the horses, mending the fence, chopping wood. Each time he passed by the window, he saw her small face peeking through the glass, watching. She didn't speak, didn't smile, but she was watching, and that was something. That evening, after supper, she sat on the edge of her bed, the wooden horse balanced in her lap. Ethan lingered at the door, unsure if she wanted company. The firelight flickered against the walls, and for the first time, she whispered a sound. It was not a sentence, not even a full word, just a broken fragment, almost lost to the crackle of the fire. "Thanks." Ethan's chest tightened, though he gave no outward sign. He only nodded once, tipping his hat again in that quiet way of his. "You're welcome." It was small, just a sip of milk, just a single word. But in the long road of healing, it was a beginning. The girl still carried the shadows of her past, scars that no man could erase. But that night, as she lay beneath the lavender-scented quilt, her eyes grew heavy not with fear, but with the tiniest spark of something different, something almost like hope. And outside her door, as he had the night before, Ethan sat on the floor, his back against the wall, keeping silent watch. The morning air was crisp, carrying the smell of dew-soaked earth and horses from the stables. Ethan leaned against the porch post, arms crossed, watching the girl step hesitantly into sunlight. She clutched the wooden horse in her hand as though it were her only shield. Her bare feet touched the board softly, cautious, as if expecting to be shouted back inside. Ethan said nothing at first. He knew that silence, when gentle, was safer than words. When her eyes finally lifted to him, filled with the same wary question she never dared speak, his voice broke the stillness. "You'll never be unwanted again." The words came out steady, carried by the kind of certainty that belonged only to men who had endured storms and survived them. He crouched down, lowering himself to her height, so she wouldn't have to look up into the face of authority. His weathered hands rested loosely on his knees, palms open, showing he meant no harm. "Not while you're here. Not while I'm alive." Her lips parted, trembling. The promise was too big, too impossible. After years of being discarded like a broken toy, she didn't answer, but her tiny fingers tightened around the wooden horse. That, Ethan thought, was enough. He didn't press her. Instead, he guided her toward the corral where the horses snorted and stamped against the morning light. The ranch was a quiet kingdom. Dusty barns, a chicken coop, rows of tools leaning against a shed. Life here was built on rhythm. Feed, water, mend, rest, repeat. Ethan knew that showing her the simplicity of work might ground her in something real, something she could rely on. The girl stood by the fence, wide-eyed, as a chestnut mare approached and sniffed her hair curiously. She flinched, almost stumbling back, but Ethan's hand hovered close, steady and calm. "She won't hurt you," he said softly. "Animals, they don't judge. They don't care about scars. They just care if you're kind." She stared at him, then at the mare's dark, patient eyes. Slowly, painfully slowly, she lifted her small hand. The mare's warm breath brushed her fingers, and for the first time, something shifted in her face. Not joy, not yet, but wonder. The rest of the day unfolded in simple lessons. Ethan chopped wood while she watched from the steps, then invited her to hand him the smaller logs. Her arms shook under the weight, but she managed. In the chicken coop, he showed her how to scatter grain. At first, she dropped the bag in fright when the hens flapped around her feet, but Ethan chuckled low, not at her, but with her. His voice was patient. "They're noisy, that's all. Noise ain't danger." In the kitchen, he made stew from beans and leftover beef, sliding a knife across the cutting board with practiced rhythm. She hovered nearby, wary of fire and metal, but when he set a carrot in front of her and gently guided her hand to slice, she obeyed. Each task was small, ordinary, but in those tasks was something she had never known before: partnership, not punishment. As the sun bled orange across the horizon, Ethan leaned back against the porch rail, wiping sweat from his brow. The girl sat cross-legged on the steps, dust smudging her dress, her face framed by stray strands of hair. For the first time, she looked less like a shadow and more like a child. She turned the wooden horse in her hands, then glanced up at him. It was a fleeting thing, almost fragile enough to break if the wind blew too hard, but her lips curved. A sound escaped her, soft and uncertain. A laugh. Ethan froze. He didn't move, didn't speak, afraid he might shatter the moment by acknowledging it. But his heart clenched so tight it almost hurt. A laugh. The first he had heard from her. Perhaps the first she had given in years. He tilted his hat low to hide his eyes, his voice rough with a promise he had already made, but now believed even more. "Told you, darling. You're safe here. Long as I breathe, nobody's going to take that from you." That night, when she curled beneath the quilt, she no longer clutched the wooden horse quite so tightly. And outside her door, Ethan kept his silent watch once more, but this time a small, secret smile lived beneath his beard. The morning sun poured gold over the fields, turning the dust motes into sparks in the air. The ranch stirred awake with the low nickers of horses and the clucking of hens. Ethan saddled a calm bay gelding, glancing toward the porch where the girl stood barefoot, hugging the rail as though it were her shield. "Want to meet him?" Ethan asked, patting the horse's strong neck. She shook her head quickly, eyes wide, but didn't run. That was progress. Instead of insisting, Ethan simply climbed onto the gelding and guided him in a slow circle. The girl's eyes followed every step. Finally, when Ethan slid down and handed her brush, he said nothing, just waited. Her small hand hovered, trembled, then touched the horse's flank. The bay flicked his tail, but didn't move. Dust rose with a brush stroked, and before long, her tentative motions turned into steady ones. Ethan smiled behind his beard. See? He likes you. Later, they carried pails of grain to the chickens. Ethan showed her how to scatter it, but she tripped, sending a cloud of feed into the air. The hens went wild, flapping and squawking, feathers flying everywhere. The girl shrieked, stumbling back as a rooster strutted indignantly past her feet. For a heartbeat, Ethan thought she might cry, but then something broke through. A small giggle, breathless and shaky. Ethan chuckled low, tipping his hat. Looks like you started a chicken parade. By midday, the kitchen filled with the smell of cornbread and beans. Ethan stirred the pot while the girl, perched on a stool, tried to knead dough. Her tiny fist pressed too hard, flour puffing up into the air and dusting her nose white. She blinked in surprise, and Ethan couldn't help the warm laugh that escaped him. Well, ain't you a little ghost? She frowned at him, then, almost rebelliously, smeared a bit of flour onto his sleeve. He raised his brows in mock sternness, and for the first time, she smiled without hiding it. The rhythm of the ranch carried them into the afternoon. Ethan repaired a broken fence rail, while she handed him nails one by one. Every so often he glanced at her, surprised by how quickly she had slipped into his world, how naturally she began to fill the spaces of silence. There was no sound sweeter, he thought, than her soft laugh echoing against the empty land that had once been nothing but grief. Toward evening, Ethan led her to the barn, the bay gelding nicker at her, and this time she walked forward on her own, laying her cheek against the horse's warm neck. She whispered something he couldn't hear, but the tenderness of the gesture nearly undid him. He saw it then, the walls she had built so fiercely beginning to crumble, brick by brick. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to live. That night, after supper, she sat on the porch steps, swinging her legs in the cooling dusk. Ethan leaned against the post, watching the stars prick the sky. She turned to him suddenly, eyes shining with quiet trust, and asked, "Will there be chores tomorrow, too?" Ethan's chest tightened, not from the question, but from the way she asked it, not in fear, but in hope. He tipped his hat, his voice gentle. "Every day, darling, but we'll make 'em fun." And in the fading light, dust swirling around the ranch yard, the sound of her laughter rose again. Clearer, brighter, no longer a rare accident, but a beginning of something whole. The sky that afternoon was heavy with dark clouds, the kind that seemed to press down on the land and choke the very air. Ethan had been mending the corral fence when the sound of wheels crunching gravel cut through the silence. His hand froze around the hammer. He turned, squinting toward the road, and saw a wagon rumbling toward the ranch. Dust trailed behind it like a warning. The girl stood in the doorway of the cabin, clutching the frame. Ethan felt her stiffen even from across the yard. She recognized them before he did. A man and a woman jumped down from the wagon, faces hard, eyes sharp with greed and bitterness. The kind of people who broke children before they could grow. Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't need an introduction. He could see the truth in the girl's trembling shoulders. "Come to take back what's ours," the man said, spitting into the dirt. His voice was low, ugly. The woman's hand grabbed the girl's arm, pulling her away from the doorway. The little one let out a sound, half gasp, half sob, but couldn't speak. Ethan stepped forward slowly, every muscle coiled like a spring. "She ain't yours." Ethan's voice was calm but thunderous. His eyes didn't waver. "Not anymore." The man sneered. "Bought her at auction, didn't you? That don't make you kin. That just makes her property. And property can be claimed." Ethan's fist clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "She's not property. She's a child. And she's under my roof now, which means you'll have to go through me." The girl's wide eyes darted between them, her breath shallow. Deep inside, a war raged, memories of being dragged away, punished, silenced. No one had ever stood for her before. No one had ever spoken like that. But fear still rooted her feet to the floorboards, whispering that promises always broke in the end. The man lunged a step closer, fists curling. Ethan moved instantly, planting himself squarely between the girl and her past. "Don't." His voice was iron. "You lay a hand on her, you'll regret it." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind tugging at the barn doors and the restless pawing of horses in their stalls. The storm clouds rolled lower, shadows stretching across the yard. The woman's lips curled. "You think you can keep her safe forever, cowboy? You'll tire, and when you do, we'll be waiting." Ethan didn't blink. "Then I'll keep standing, as long as it takes." His hand rested on his belt, near the worn handle of his revolver. Not a threat, but a promise carved in steel. The man spat again, frustration in every movement. He knew the look in Ethan's eyes, the look of someone who would rather die than move aside. After a tense silence, the pair climbed back onto their wagon. The wheels groaned as it turned, rolling back down the dusty trail, leaving only the smell of sweat and menace behind. Ethan stayed still until the wagon disappeared over the horizon. Only then did he turn, his eyes softening as they found the girl. She was still frozen in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, tears streaking her dusty cheeks. "You're safe," Ethan said gently, voice breaking the silence. He knelt down in the dirt, making himself small before her. "Nobody's going to take you. Not while I'm here." For a long moment, she stared at him, chest heaving, torn between belief and disbelief. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she stepped forward. Her tiny hand reached out, clutching his shirt front as though testing if he was real. Ethan's heart clenched when he felt the tremor in her fingers. And for the first time, she whispered words not out of fear but fragile hope. "You stayed." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of her trust heavier than any fight he'd ever stood in. He wrapped his arms around her carefully, like she might break, and whispered back, "Always." Above them, thunder cracked, but inside the ranch house, for the first time, she knew the storm could be faced, not alone, but with someone who would fight for her no matter the cost. The night after the confrontation was heavy, like the ranch itself held its breath. The girl had not spoken a word since the wagon had vanished into the horizon. She sat curled in the corner of her bed, knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes wide and hollow. Every creak of the cabin would made her flinch. Ethan sat outside her door again, the soft scrape of his chair legs against the floor, the only proof that she wasn't alone. When morning came, the sky was clear, but the storm lingered inside her chest. She tried to help with chores, but her hands trembled too much to carry a pail of water without spilling it. At last, she sank down on the porch steps, burying her face in her arms. Silent sobs shook her frame. It wasn't just fear, it was exhaustion. Years of running, hiding, hurting had cracked open all at once. Ethan watched from a distance, torn. He knew the kind of wounds she carried weren't ones a man could stitch close with words. Still, he walked over, boots crunching softly on the dirt. He crouched near her, not touching, just waiting until her sobs slowed. "It's all right," he said quietly. "You let it out. You don't have to be strong all the time." She lifted her face, blotched and wet, her lips trembling. "They'll come back," she whispered hoarsely. "They always come back." Her voice carried the resignation of someone who had learned the world had no safe places. Ethan's chest ached at the sound. He thought for a moment, then stood and walked into the cabin. When he returned, something was in his hands. A pair of small leather boots, worn smooth from care, polished though not new. They had clearly been kept aside for years. He set them gently on the porch step beside her. The girl blinked at them, confusion knitting her brow. She touched them hesitantly, like they might vanish. "For me?" she asked in a broken whisper. Ethan nodded. "They were meant for someone else once," he said softly, eyes distant. "But life didn't give me the chance to see that through." His gaze settled on her, steady as the horizon. "Now they're meant for you." She swallowed hard, unable to speak. Her tiny hands slipped into the boots, tugging them on. They were just a little big, but when she stood, she wobbled less than before. The leather wrapped her feet like armor. Ethan's voice broke the silence. "You'll never have to walk in fear again." His words were not loud, but they carried the weight of an oath. "Not as long as I'm here." Her breath hitched. The boots were more than leather and stitching. They were a promise. They meant she wasn't meant to run barefoot through pain anymore, wasn't destined to stumble down roads that always ended in loss. They meant roots, safety, and a chance of future. For the first time since she had come into his care, she reached for him, not in fear, but in trust. Her hand found his rough, callous one, and she clung to it. Ethan felt the smallest squeeze of her fingers, fragile yet determined. It was like watching a flower push up through cracked earth. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they weren't just sorrow. They were relief, maybe even the first flicker of joy. She looked down at the boots, then back at Ethan. "They fit," she whispered, and a shy smile touched her lips. Ethan smiled back, a faint, weary smile that carried both pain and hope. "Good," he said simply, "because you're going to need them. We've got a lot of miles to walk together. But this time, it won't be in fear. It'll be in freedom." The girl didn't answer, but she didn't need to. The way she stood taller, the way she held his hand, the way her shoulders eased, those were answers enough. For the first time, she believed someone might truly keep her safe. As the sun dipped behind the hills that evening, casting long golden light across the dusty yard, Ethan and the girl sat side by side on the porch. She leaned against him, her boots tapping lightly against the wood, a fragile piece wrapped around them both, like a blanket after a storm. And in that quiet, the gift of new shoes became more than leather. It became a vow carved into the path of both their lives. The road ahead would not be easy, but it would no longer be walked alone. The days after the gift of the boots passed quietly. The girl wore them every morning as though they were her armor, each scuff and step etching new confidence into her. The ranch, once a place of silence and dust, began to echo with the light rhythm of her laughter. She carried water pails with determination, brushed down the horses with care, and sometimes sat on the fence humming broken little tunes. Ethan never forced her. He only let her move at her own pace, and slowly she began to claim the land as her own. One afternoon, as the sun lowered behind the barn, Ethan found her standing at the edge of the fields. Her boots were planted firmly in the dirt, her small figure framed by endless sky. She turned to him, chin lifted just enough to show courage she hadn't known before. "I don't want to go anywhere else," she said softly, as if testing the words on her tongue. "I want to stay here." For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. He had expected her to take comfort in the ranch, but this was different. This wasn't survival. This was choice. He swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded slowly. "Then this is your home," he said, his voice thick, "for as long as you want it." That night, he brought out an old wooden box from the loft. Inside were small trinkets, a carved horse, a faded shawl, scraps of cloth that had once belonged to his late wife. He handed the carved horse to the girl. "I made it years ago," he explained. "Didn't think I'd ever give it to anyone, but I think it belongs to you now." Her fingers closed around it with reverence, as though he had given her the key to a new life. The cabin itself seemed to change with her presence. The corners that once gathered dust now held small things of hers. A ribbon, a book Ethan had found, a pair of socks drying by the fire. The emptiness that had weighed on the house for years was slowly filled with belonging. Even the animals sensed it. The old dog followed her wherever she went, and the horses nickered more often when she appeared at the fence. Ethan noticed the way her shoulders no longer hunched in fear. She walked straighter, slept deeper, and even argued playfully with him about chores. It wasn't the kind of family he had once dreamed of, but it was something purer, forged in the fire of choice and trust. One dawn, the two of them sat together on the porch, the world still hushed in early light. The horizon glowed faint pink, the kind of sunrise that whispered of new beginnings. The girl leaned against the wooden post, her boots dangling as she kicked softly at the air. Ethan sat beside her, coffee steaming in his hand, content just to share the silence. She glanced at him and whispered, almost like a vow of her own, "I'm not scared anymore." Ethan turned to her, studying the quiet strength in her eyes. He didn't say much. Words often felt too small for what lived between them. Instead, he reached out and squeezed her hand, rough calluses pressing against her small fingers. She squeezed back, firmly this time. The ranch, once a hollow shell of his loneliness, had become something neither of them had expected, a home stitched together not by blood, but by love, a place where broken pieces fit, where the unwanted became chosen, where fear gave way to safety. As the sun broke fully over the hills, bathing the land in gold, Ethan thought of the girl's journey, the sack torn from her head, the bruises, the mistrust, the tears, the tiny steps toward trust. She had been delivered to his ranch as something unwanted, a burden no one claimed. Now, she was more than that. She was family. The girl rested her head lightly on his arm, her new boots tapping against the porch with a slow, steady rhythm. She closed her eyes, safe enough to drift in the warmth of dawn. Ethan didn't move, afraid to disturb the fragile peace that felt like the very heartbeat of the ranch itself. And as the day began, the truth settled over them both, quiet and sure. She came unwanted and broken, but now she was safe, chosen, and finally loved,